Good evening, everyone. I am Shrunika Kannan, Chair of the Communications and Outreach Committee at EdTech Society and Assistant Professor of French at the University of Madras. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Masterclass 19, Historical Thinking in the Time of AI. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about who we are at EdTech Society. EdTech Society is a professional association started in India by individuals who are committed to improve instruction and learning through the use of educational technologies. Our members are researchers, developers, and practitioners in the field of educational technology. Joining EdTech Society offers you numerous benefits. You can network and collaborate with experts in educational technology. You will find plenty of opportunities for professional growth, and you can, of course, have affiliation with international associations, awards, scholarship, and internship programs. Reduced registration fees for annual conferences and EdTech Society's faculty development programs, winter and summer schools. Access to key resources and best practices in educational technology. We conduct various events like Masterclass, Industry Talk, In Focus Interview, Perspective, Panel Discussion, and then, of course, our flagship event, the T4E Conference, and many, many more upcoming. So join us and unlock a world of opportunities in educational technology. For more details, you can visit our website at etsociety.org. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our esteemed speaker for today, Dr. Vikram Vincent. He's the founder and CTO of Freethought Labs in Bangalore, India. Vikram, it's an EdTech startup. He periodically writes OpEds for The Hindu on a range of issues. He has a PhD from the Educational Technology IDP at IIT Bombay around historical thinking and technology. So he really is the right person to talk to us about today's topic. He conducts teacher training programs for both in-service and pre-service teachers. And on behalf of EdTech Society, I extend a warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Vikram. We are delighted to have you today. But quickly, before I hand over the session to the expert, there is a small announcement. Pay close attention to what our speaker is saying. And if you have any queries, you can post them in the comment section and answers will be given towards the end of the session. Right? So now let me hand over the session to Dr. Vikram. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shrunika. Thank you. So before we start, there was a question of who is this session relevant to? So to be able to understand this talk, you should have just studied basic history at school. But if you have not studied history, that too is okay. So don't worry. It's a very basic talk. We shall cover a lot of breadth without going too much in depth. I will try to use a case study method where I just bring out two simple case studies and hope that my ideas are conveyed, and I'm open to questions after that. So my PhD dissertation was titled Technology Framework for Learning Historical Thinking. Basically, it was the use of systems thinking to the study of learning of history. So if you would like to know more about my PhD dissertation, I would request you to go to our Educational Technology website, which is listed over there. And we have a research drop-down menu under which we have our PhD dissertations uploaded. And I would encourage you to read the abstract of my PhD dissertation over there. But to give you a simple idea, I was trying to help. I realized that kids had difficulty in understanding history, or rather doing history, because when I was in school, I would most probably memorize names, events, timelines, and when the exam time came, I would regurgitate all this content and somehow pass the exam with, let's say, an 80 or 90 or 95% in history. But then as I studied further, I realized that it was not simply about memorizing history. You could actually solve real world problems and create real world solutions by learning how to engage with history. But I found that children had difficulty comprehending complex concepts because history is very linear in terms of the text that is used. So I thought, is it possible, because I come from a very computer science background, and I'm used to representing very difficult concepts using various diagrams, like the diagrams which are shown on the screen. So I thought, can't we use these systems thinking's diagrams, which are very common in computer science and other domains, in history? So through a process, I adapted various notations. These small diagrams are called notations. I adapted various notations for history, and that was a contribution of my PhD dissertation. A simple example here, I had asked students to solve a very complex problem. I said, hey, if you learned the first war of Indian independence, and I gave them a very detailed case study of the first war of Indian independence, and I took them through various ideas of the first war. I said, can you represent those ideas graphically? So this is one simple example of how the first war of Indian independence was represented. And the tool that you're looking at, the History Maker tool, was a contribution of my as part of my PhD dissertation. Another example, a bit more complicated as well, because there were many people, ideas, concepts involved in the study of history. So before we move forward, the first question that pops up is there a difference between history and historical thinking? So history is a discipline. It refers to the study of past events, particularly related to human beings. It encompasses the recording, analysis, and interpretation of what happened in the past. So that's history as a discipline. Historical thinking, on the other hand, refers to very specific thinking skills, or rather thinking methodologies that historians and students use to critically engage and interpret various historical narratives and evidence. So in simple language, historical thinking is the application of critical thinking to the discipline of history. So it's not rocket science. So if you're studying critical thinking in other areas, you take these critical thinking skills and then apply them to the study of history, or rather to doing history. But there is a complexity. What is that? History is considered a ill-structured domain. Now, what is the meaning of this ill-structured domain? An ill-structured domain refers to a field of study or an area of knowledge that lacks clear or well-defined parameters and rules. In such domains, knowledge is often complex, ambiguous, and interconnected, making it difficult to apply straightforward formula-based solutions. Now, if you think of various science or math problems, normally you would have a formula or a set of processes which you would apply. And given a very specific problem, you would find the solution quite easily if you apply the process or the formula. But when you're dealing with human beings, you cannot apply such straight-jacketed approaches. Another example of ill-structured domain, apart from history, is politics, law, ethics. So why is history considered ill-structured? Now, the moment an event occurs, some historic moment, let's say this talk that I'm giving at this point of time, there is no reliable way. I mean, even if you are recording what is happening at this moment through this YouTube channel or through this particular software that I'm using, there is no reliable way to completely capture what's happening. For example, I'm actually experiencing butterflies in my stomach, and definitely that's not going to get captured through the camera, or maybe the fact that some of you smiled the moment I said I'm having butterflies in my stomach, right? Or the thoughts that are going through your mind as you're listening to me. None of this is captured through this video. Second, there are multiple perspectives. And I'll give you an example. What we as Indians called the First War of Indian Independence in 1857, the Britishers called Sepoy Mutiny. Now, both of us were right in our own experiences or in our own understanding of the series of events that took place. So, who among us is right would be the wrong question. Rather, how do we factor in these various perspectives and build a larger image is very important here. A third aspect would be the subjectivity in data interpretation. Now, because of the fact that some data was left behind, now let's say archaeological data, artifacts such as manuscripts, books, or pottery, or bone fragments, coins, songs, or inscriptions on cave walls. So, when you collect various of these artifacts, we would have to give reason to that limited data that we have collected. There is no reliable way for us to go back and ask those who are part of that specific moment in time, what were they thinking? Why did they do what they did? What were the motivations? What were the factors that influenced them? Were they forced to do things which they did not like, right? So we would apply our individual subjectivity to the interpretation of data. And because history is that deals with human beings, a lot of complexity and uncertainty comes in, and we as historical thinkers, or or critical thinkers, we would have to state quite explicitly various assumptions that we might have while trying to fill in the gaps in knowledge. So, since I do teach students, and even though I've explained certain points in the last two slides, my students would go back to the initial question. So, sir, is historical thinking only related to the study of history? So I'm going to we're sort of going to dive deep in, and we're going to start with a case study. And this is a favorite of mine, which I give students of different batches. It's a design-based task which I normally give them to identify fake news. And I normally tell my students, why don't you use ChatGPT, insert a fake news snippet, not necessarily just the title, but rather content that you might have from an article or a video. Enter it into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT and use ChatGPT to find out if the news is real or fake. Now, most students would take at least 2-3 days sometimes, or 2-3 sessions, if they're not guided, and they would say, and they would come to the conclusion that ChatGPT is unable to provide them with reliable data whether a news is real or fake. And the reason for that is that these large language models, or these AI models, are trained on data that is available on the internet. So it carries within it the biases, or the preconceptions, or the misconceptions, or the alternate conceptions, or even all the evils of society into itself, right? So ChatGPT will not be able to tell you whether the news is real or fake. So for this task, since I value my life a lot, I would like you to come up with your own example. Since this is election season, right? You can Google search online for various campaigns by various political parties and the claims that they made around history. Okay, so I'm quite sure most of you are familiar, but if not, do Google search a bit. I will not give you an example over here, but I'm going to give you three cognitive biases that fake news tends to have, right? That are common. I mean, there are multiple cognitive biases that lead to fake news getting propagated a lot. But I'm going to give you three, right? Which I think perhaps are relevant. This is again a very subjective thought. The first being that it's a very that fake news tends to tap into the emotions. So the first cognitive bias that I would like to talk about is emotional reasoning, wherein news that evokes a strong emotional response can be more readily accepted as true, regardless of the actual facts. So fake news often exploits these strong emotions like fear, anger, excitement, and this can override a lot of rational thinking or critical thinking. So this is one of the primary cognitive biases, in my opinion. A second one is confirmation bias. So this bias means that individuals are more likely to believe fake news that aligns with their existing views and dismiss or ignore news that contradicts their beliefs. A third cognitive bias. Now, the reason I'm bringing these specific cognitive biases, is I'm going to bring in why historical thinking is relevant over here. So the third cognitive bias is cognitive dissonance, where people tend to resolve the dissonance by either rejecting or rationalizing or ignoring information that conflicts with their beliefs. So if they feel that something is going to lead them to say that, hey, this is false, they would try to rationalize it. So that the information aligns very comfortably with what their preconceived notions are. So what does historical thinking, I mean, now the question comes to, how can historical thinking come in here to help learners, students, or adults to deal with this fake news concept? But first, the most important thing to do the moment you get any news that touches your emotions is to breathe. Like, breathe a couple of times, calm yourself down, and when you're calm, then we should ask a set of questions. So there are various rubrics for historical thinking that helps learners break down sort of to break down a fake news or a news that they may assume to be fake, or let's make it more neutral, to break down a news and see whether it is real or fake. So what are these skills or historical thinking skills? So on your screen you will see a set of close reading strategies, which involves sourcing of content from various primary or secondary sources. So the primary source could be, let's say, the original documents that were created, which you might have access to. Maybe if you go to a museum, you might see these, or sometimes copies of these documents are made and kept for analysis or for sharing. Secondary documents or secondary sources could be the analysis of these primary sources, which, let's say, historians or other scholars may have used to interpret them. So these close reading strategies of sourcing, and then the other one of critical reading. I'm not going to go into depth at present. I'm just going to keep the slide open as I cover some of the ideas. So this sourcing and critical reading skills are going to help you in figuring out whether, and please look at the next part of the rubric, whether the news that you're reading satisfies four parts. The first part is, what are the claims being made by the news? So you would have to very clearly see, for example, the news could say, a while ago, somebody made a claim that an actress had died of some cancer, right? A claim was made. But if you look at the last column, no evidence was provided. And the corroboration of that claim was that various channels, TV channels or Twitter or Instagram, simply reflected the initial post that was made. So while, for example, the claim appeared to be legitimate because it came from a primary source, the evidence to show that the claim was true, that the specific uh, personality, the YouTube personality or the Instagram personality had died of a specific illness, happened to be false. There was no evidence to that. In fact, the YouTube, the Instagram influencer came back and said, "Hey, actually, I'm not dead. I just did this as a stunt to raise awareness about a specific issue." Now, whether that was in good faith or not is for you to decide. I do not want to go there. But from a historical thinking perspective, a claim has to have very strong evidence. And that evidence needs to be either primary sources or it could be secondary sources. And these sources need to be corroborated. And you would have to be able to contextualize. Now, what does this mean? So whenever a historical event happens, it happens in a very specific context. For example, at one point of time, it was okay. Let me use a more okay. So at one point of time, we would have kings and queens and slaves, right? So for that point in time in the past, it was okay, right? I mean, if I look back, they had kings, queens, slaves, a very clear-cut delineation. So for them, at that point of time, the society accepted what was taking place at that point of time. But if I look at it from here, in 2024 or in this century, I would say, hey, what happened then was wrong. So there's a very clear context difference between now and then. So this context needs to be very clear. So we would need to teach learners how to understand or how to identify very specific claims being made in a fake news or in a news, to understand first of all what is the claim being made. Then we would teach our learner to see if that specific news has provided evidence. Okay, then we would ask our learner to figure out whether that evidence is genuine or not. So we would have various things like reliable sources. For example, a government document would be considered a reliable source. A primary document, a primary source, that is a document which comes directly from history, let's say the Constitution of India, the original document, would be a primary source. So it would be a reliable source, right? So we would see uh, uh, the sources being used as part of the evidence. Then we would see whether there is sufficient corroboration, right, from multiple alternate sources. So these skills of claims, evidence, corroboration, and contextualization would be taught to a learner, and they would then try to figure out whether the news is real or not. So the bottom line that I'm trying to say is that AI cannot identify whether a news is real or fake, because AI by default brings in various biases. And because it is not self aware, the biases that are inherent in that system will sort of come in the algorithms or in the content that it provides you. So this is where a human being would have to use their intellect and develop historical thinking in order to be able to identify whether a news is real or fake. Now, you would realize that a fake news would have aspects which are partly true and a lot of false, right? And some of the new fake news that I've seen comes from historical data, historical events which are quoted, let's say, in political discourse or in campaigns, which comes, let's say, which has parts of religion in it, or which has politics in it, right? So these are very ill-structured domains, as I mentioned before. So we need to teach our learners how to identify uh, these ill-structured this content from ill-structured domains, and to figure out whether it is real or fake. And historical thinking is one of the ways in which to do it. Of course, in order to abstract it, I will also say that historical thinking is basically critical thinking applied to a ill-structured domain like history, politics, law, or ethics. Okay, so we have the close reading. So to summarize, we have close reading strategies such as sourcing and critical reading. Then we have certain strategies or procedural concepts such as corroboration and contextualization. And we have some procedural concepts such as claims and evidence. So this particular rubric that I've shown on the screen is from the ARCH project that Stanford had at one point of time. So you can look up the Stanford History Education Project, SHEG, and this particular rubric will be available on their website. There are various other rubrics as well. You may some of the other rubrics are thinking historically. So if you just do a simple Google search, you will find almost 4-5 different rubrics, which are all reliable by various reliable sources. So if you are a teacher or a learner, how do I teach my child? Maybe you might have children of your own, maybe you're a teacher somewhere, or maybe you yourself want to learn historical thinking. So there are so historical thinking is based on the cognitive development of the individual. So if you're with a very young child at the age of 5 to 8, it is not possible to teach them historical thinking because their mind will not be able to understand what is multiple perspectives, or the fact that data is lost the moment an event occurs. They wouldn't be able to understand these complex concepts. So in early childhood education, in the age group of 5 to 8, normally we go about with storytelling and narratives. We also teach children role play and simulations, and we also provide them with various visuals like posters or pictures in books. And through these, in a very simplistic manner, we teach a child historical thinking. So this is the most simplest form. So here, even comics are a very good source to teach historical thinking. A very nice concept would be historical fiction as well, which comes in the comic book format, which children could use. But of course, at this stage, a child is not able to discern whether the content you're teaching them is true, false, or partly true, partly false. So a child wouldn't be able to comprehend that. So as you progress to a higher level, that is at the elementary education level, 9 to 12, we teach children biographies and personal stories. We also teach children various timelines. How do events happen on a timeline? How multiple timelines could be stacked up to each other. Let's say the events that were happening in India, the events that were happening in Europe, the events that were happening in other parts of the world, let's say during World War II. So those are multiple timelines running in parallel, which are ordered by region, for example, right? So you would teach them how these various timelines are related with each other. So you would, at this stage, you would also introduce children to primary sources. Perhaps you would take them to the museum. You would show them artifacts in a museum. So these are, some of the ideas. In the middle school, let's say from 13 to 15. Here, perhaps the child is now able to understand what are multiple perspectives that each human being, because of the way they develop, the background that they come from. It could be caste, it could be class, it could be gender, it could be language, it could be region, ethnicity, right? So based on that, if let's assume that if you have people from all these backgrounds come together and witness a specific event, that even if they were to witness the exact same event, that they would go away with multiple perspectives. So you would teach a learner how to analyze these multiple perspectives. So you would, something which I have not explicitly mentioned here is that history that is conventionally taught tends to be very content specific. It is very content specific. But as you move towards historical thinking, you will realize that these thinking skills are very content agnostic. That is, they can be abstracted. It does not matter what the content is. So while I was talking about historical thinking, let's say from the history textbook, I also brought in the idea of fake news. Now, fake news might have parts of history, or it may not have parts of history. But the thinking skills that you teach a child, the historical thinking skills that you teach a child while they're learning history, could be directly used to identify fake news, right? Very important. So we need to move our learner from being very content centric to a more content agnostic stage, where they can take themselves out of a very specific situation. You see, this also comes in when you want to address the issue of cognitive biases, because you see, these cognitive biases, one of the reasons that, from my understanding, is because when you marry yourself to a specific idea, or to a specific concept, or to a specific viewpoint, right? These are all content. You are unable to step back and critically evaluate it. But if you're able to become content agnostic, then you're not very emotionally wedded to those ideas, and you can look at it quite critically. And let's say fake news could be caught quite easily. So as you go to higher school levels, you have things like thematic studies. For example, the concept of revolution, the concept of democracy, the concept of migration, right? How did people migrate? How did language, culture, ethnicity, how did it evolve over a period of time? For example, the concept of marriage, very interesting, right? Did you know that we are right now in the fifth form of marriage, right? Where, let's say, you have one husband and one wife. Now, if you look at the document called Ancient Society, which is one of the seminal uh, um, uh, uh, thing which I'd encourage you to look up, it said that the original form of family had woman at the head of the tribe. The woman could marry anyone and everyone across the tribe, and the child that was born from this relationship would be taken care by the community. So that was the first form, and this is several millennia ago. So don't assume that, hey, my God, what is this? How could they do this, right? So this is when the human beings were hunter gatherers, very animalistic in their thought process, right? You're not yet trying to, you don't have the ethics or the concepts that we have now. So the second form of family, for example, I'm sort of just giving a simple example of how perspectives and culture and very complex concepts can be taught. So in the second form of family, they realized that the offspring, when the woman married her husband, I mean her father, brother, or son, the quality of offspring was of low. So they said, hey, you cannot marry the first gen. You could marry anyone and everyone else in the tribe. The third form of family, they said, you can marry anyone and everyone in the other tribe, right? Not in this tribe. So, and slowly, as people from being hunter gatherers started plowing the land and rearing cattle and settling down, the concept of the kind of traditional form of family where you have one husband, one wife started evolving, right? If you notice, I've used various ideas from storytelling narratives, mental imagery, personal story, sort of a timeline, uh, there is a sort of different perspective to a very complex concept of marriage, to bring it to a thematic study, right? So if I'm trying to, through this simple example, I'm trying to bring in these various ideas together. So the current form of family where man is the head has, I mean, again, this is a very patriarchal notion of family where man is the head of the thing, started only around 10,000 years ago, right? When, let's say, in the fourth form of family, the woman could always be happy with him. But when the man moved out, he would take his cattle and his land, and it would go to his sister's children. So the woman was upset. The head of the tribe was upset. Why should the property, of cattle and thing not come to my child or to his child? So a small change took place, which led us to this particular form of family. No longer would the man come to the woman's house, but the woman would now go to the man's house. And this small change brought in the patriarchal notion of family, right? So, see, this is a very historical thinking way of looking at various complex past events in its own specific context. Of course, now we also have live-in relationships and a lot of other concepts, right? So you see that the ideas are changing over time. So this requires a very critical source analysis and a very interdisciplinary approach, which you can teach higher age children once they're 15, 16, and so on. But as you go towards, let's say, college and university education, you can also teach your learners advanced tools like GIS mapping, how to visualize data with various tools, how to use AI for analysis, how to use online archives. You would also go into various theoretical and critical history, where it's no longer just accepting the content in it, but rather dissecting it into its various pieces and looking at it from various theoretical understandings that you might come from, right? So these are, and you also teach advanced research methods to your learners for them to be able to look at history in a more unique way. So you will realize that history no longer remains static, but the interpretation starts taking on very dynamic forms. And just like science, where you say that as I get a new piece of data, I'm going to change my understanding. So does historical thinking say that as you get newer forms, or as you look at historical events with different lenses, history is going to change. The way it's not going to be static in the way that it was once taught. So as you work with adults, you will also realize that adults don't like to be taught. So here you would have to use personal experiences of an adult. You would have to, let's assume that you're working with an adult learner who hasn't studied all these historical thinking ideas in the past, right? They may not have studied it. They may be starting afresh. So you would start from where the adult is, their perspectives, their understandings, their multiple conceptions. And from there, you are going to try to have a community based learning where people come together through collective understanding to re evaluate what's happening in terms of their historical understanding of events and look at current day events. So these lifelong learning approaches could be facilitated through various, I mean, one is in person. That's my personal favorite. Even though I'm from an EdTech background, one of my personal favorites is always working with learners in person. I would always prefer that over, let's say, online platforms. But then again, we don't always have that luxury. So using MOOCs or various online platforms is definitely encouraged. So a question does come in, right? Since the title was historical thinking in the age of AI. Where does a human being excel over AI in historical thinking? Now, I've already covered these ideas through my narratives, but if I were to distill it down or rather summarize it, it is to be able to contextualize. Now, a very hard problem, since my edtech startup is working on providing feedback to children, on various long form essays, I've realized one of the hard problems is using AI to identify context and to give context, especially in long form essays, right? Unless it's very specifically so. But a human being, on the other hand, is able to look at context much better and more intuitively, unlike an AI. So that's an advantage. Also, we have a very intuitive notion of the social and cultural understanding of various complex contexts involving human beings. And at least off late, a lot of cultural sensitivity has come into many of us, right? And we're looking at various changes that are happening in society with a more sensitive point of view, with a bit more empathy. And there is this shift taking place. Of course, there's also a back, a push back as well. But by and large, this change is taking place. So human beings have that. And AI, on the other hand, by the nature of its design, that it is being trained on biased data, that it is based on algorithms, will not have this. Further, a machine has no way to have has no way to think of things in terms of morals or to think of things in ethics. Is it okay to kill someone, or is it okay to do something which is immoral? The machine would not be able to. Plus, morals and ethics are very culturally contextual, or gender contextual, or region context, or language context. It's not uniform, right? You don't have a uniform morality or a uniform ethic. So the criticism, let's say, of AI had been that AI models, LLMs, had been trained on the Western ideas, the Western notions, and then they're being applied in our context. For example, the a group called the Algorithmic Justice League said that an AI could not recognize Black people, African Americans, because it had only been trained on data of white people. So that was a very serious criticism of the algorithms and the data itself. So now you'd have to look at it from various contexts in India, the diversity that we have over here, right? So that's something which AI cannot is nowhere close, but human beings are. We also are able to debate or synthesize ideas, and of course, the emotional intelligence that we bring in, right? I mentioned empathy and the personal experience and the intuition, and the fact that we are able to interpret ideas quite flexibly, unless of course we are rigid, and as we grow older we do become rigid, right? We have certain ideas that we hold on very dearly. But if we are trained to be historical thinkers or critical thinkers, uh, definitely we are a bit more flexible in our approach, and we are creative and innovative in our thinking. So the question is, where does AI excel? And I'm going to just give one simple example before I sort of come to questions. And there's something called historiography. Predictive historiography. So, what is this historiography? It is the writing of history based on a critical analysis, evaluation, and selection of authentic source materials, and composition of these materials into a narrative subject to scholarly methods of criticism. I would ask you to go and read it up if you're interested. So, for example, an AI could be used to analyze the political climate over decades to predict an election outcome or a social unrest. How would you do it? Well, you would compile data of multiple decades across regions, across gender, and then you would feed this historical data into an AI model, and then you would ask it to analyze the patterns of these various political engagements that took place and the public opinions that were generated by people engaging in these debates. For example, there's a lot of analysis happening on Twitter discourses, of course, now called X. I mean, it's like uh, an idea that we need to constantly saying X, formerly called Twitter, or let's say on Reddit or anywhere else, and these or TikTok, and these engagements of people are analyzed, and governments, for example, could forecast how a particular political trend or how somebody might vote in a specific election. So there are problems here in terms of the accuracy and reliability of these AIs, already mentioned. And one weakness of an AI is that it cannot account for the chaotic nature of a human being, because a human being can vary very radically. One human being can vary radically from yesterday to tomorrow, or within the day itself, and they might do completely different things in very specific contexts. And this an AI cannot accurately or reliably predict. Of course, it also brings in the biases that are already in in the data that has been fed. You also have ethical implications, for example, right? Again, this is historical thinking at a different level, where I would, if you're not yet, I mean, if you're not familiar, I would encourage you to look up the Facebook Cambridge Analytica data scandal, where data from Facebook of users was collected quite illegally and surreptitiously, and advertisements were sent out to manipulate people to vote in very specific ways, because they had understood historically how a person would think based on their engagements on various content on Facebook, and then using the historical understanding of each of these individuals, because you see Facebook is linked to WhatsApp is linked to Instagram, and then all these are linked to websites all over the internet. So you would know how a person would behave, what are they buying, what are they selling, how they're talking, and based on that, they would try to manipulate a person into doing something they may not normally do by providing certain cues, or so this is again an ethical implication directly related to historical thinking and AI. And if you're interested, this is an open area of research that you could get into. So I'm not saying that something is good or bad because it's in the way in which we go about applying it. Rather, I would say, hey, we need to bring in a balance between these technological possibilities and the ill-structured domain of history, right? So we need to deal with the inherent uncertainties of these historical processes. So, okay, let me just skip this. So if you're looking for research areas, I'm just listing four which I have come across more often. One is, how does the brain function, the various cognitive processes that are used in historical understanding, in historical thinking. This is an open area. A large amount of research has been done, but as AI and as human beings are interacting with advanced technologies, this is changing. So it's still an open domain for intervention. Then how is the digital technology impacting historical scholarship? Now, this third part, methodical innovations. For example, as part of my PhD work, I used design-based research as a methodology to historical thinking and history. So I try to use an idea from design thinking, design-based research into historical thinking. So that was sort of a slight innovation in my PhD work. So, and also, what are the various pedagogical and curricular innovations that are required to learn these historical thinking skills the uh, based on the latest innovations that are happening? How do you utilize it to teach and learn historical thinking in the classroom? So, having sort of covered a large amount of material, I would like to open the session now for questions. I would request you all to post your questions in the, I'm assuming, the YouTube comment link, and somebody would collect them and post them here.
Yeah, so we have our first question on the screen now. Are you able to see it? Let me read that out for you. How is historical thinking different from, say, the journalistic process of finding the truth, for example?
Thank you very much, Gokul. So as you would understand, even journalists use a lot of critical thinking in their approach. Um, in the start, I said that historical thinking is nothing but critical thinking applied to the discipline of history, where I gave a specific context that history has is an ill-structured domain, that there are a lot of uncertainties, right? So the journalistic process also would use large parts of these historical thinking or critical thinking. And in that, we are not moving towards an absolute truth. I do not agree that there is an absolute truth. I mean, those of you who are religious, and I would respect your opinion. I would say that okay, maybe the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the Vedas, Upanishads might be an absolute truth for you. But if I were to look at it from as a rationalist, as a scientist, I would say that truth is iterative. You're moving towards multiple truths. There is no absolute truth. There is more of a relative truth. So the journalistic process is critical thinking being applied to elicit that truth from a specific context. I hope that answers your question. It's not different, it's overlapping.
Right. Yeah. So there's definitely commonality between the two. Right. Great. I have a question. So I was fascinated by the way that you had classified specific levels of learning the skill based on age, right? Whereas
Mhm.
just going by the topic, one would have thought that a skill like this is better taught at the higher education level. So my question to you is, how likely do you think is that something uh, like this skill, especially, is added to the curriculum in schools? How likely do you think, or how sooner do you think that should happen?
So when I was doing, okay, this is when I was a child type of a moment. History was just taught as content, right? But having worked with IB school, the International Baccalaureate students, as a teacher trainer, I found that historical thinking was actually being taught in that curriculum from a much earlier stage and at a much advanced level than, let's say, the CBSE or the ICSE or the state boards. In fact, state boards are lagging behind um, a lot, and I think we would need to look at the more advanced IB education curriculum and update us. And you should understand that these ideas that came in of having age based classification of teaching learning techniques is one idea. You're right, you can mix and match based on the child you're working with the class you're working with. Because let's say when I was the last semester, I taught a batch of students and I realized that they were way more advanced in the thought processes than I had anticipated, and I had to change my approach quite radically in the middle of the curriculum, right? So this age based classification would have to be rethought out again contextually. Yeah.
Great. We have one more question that's on the screen right now. What are the theoretical frameworks for using historical thinking to analyze past events? For example, how students' learning styles change due to the introduction of computers in school. So, what theoretical framework? So, really research perspective.
So I think there are two parts here, right? The second part of how student styles changed, you would have to look at it. It's a different idea altogether, whereas theoretical frameworks for historical thinking is again different. There are many. Let me put them into my slides. When I update the slides, I shall put in. There are three, four which I have personally used while doing my PhD work. I will update the slides with that. The second part I don't think is directly relevant to this topic because it's learning styles, which is different from historical thinking.
Great. Um, yeah. So, I think we don't have any other questions for now. Is there anything that you would like to add before we wrap up? Is there anything that you would want to say more that you think that you didn't have time for?
So one idea that I've noticed, because I personally subscribe to the need of historical thinking, and is I've noticed this contradiction that as we are moving forward, history departments across universities across the world are being shut down. And I think that's a matter of concern from a policy perspective. And you should understand that I come from a computer science engineering background, and then getting into EdTech, which is interdisciplinary. But even as a novice historical thinker, I find it very concerning, because in simple terms, it also means that our people, our citizens, are not going to be able to effectively engage and intervene into the political discourse that is taking place. And it would cede space to very absolutist ideas. And I think that we need to ask, why are history departments across the world being shutting down? I think that's a very important question. And I thought I couldn't put that directly in my slides, but it's a matter of concern that I've written about in some article of mine. But I think that is something I should just leave hanging, perhaps, as a question for others to think about.
100%. I think as an academic from the humanities, I'm also on board with that. We have one last question, like a quick question. Seeing how LLMs and the likes have developed from the quality of output just 2 years ago and where they are now, do you see maybe the historical thinking framework can be something that AI itself can be taught? I think you.
Absolutely. My startup is trying to do just that. Yes, we are trying to train data. We're trying to train synthetic data that can do certain tasks. How to identify claims, how to identify evidence. In fact, if you go to indianqanun.org, there is a very rudimentary AI being used in the background, where it tries to identify what is the plaintiff's evidence, what is the respondent/defendant's evidence. It's still rudimentary. It's not very well functioning, because the data being used is not appropriate. The annotations are not well done. It requires a lot of donkey work to be very raw, right? It requires a lot of annotation to be done. But yes, however, as I mentioned before, the difficult problem is identifying context, and that is something the human brain is more adept at doing from a much earlier stage with much lesser information. A child can identify context better than a very complicated AI. Even GPT-4, I have a premium subscription to it. I know very well that GPT-4 cannot identify complex contexts.
Right. So I think we're at the end of our session, but we've had some great questions and lovely answers.
Thank you
Before we wrap up quickly, I will quickly make some announcements. Those who are following the webinar, please, once you log into the member space on our website, you'll be able to download the questionnaire. Once you answer the questions, you'll be able to get the certificate. So thank you for being with us. As we come to the end of this insightful masterclass, I want to express my heartfelt thanks to everyone for their participation and engagement. My sincere gratitude to Dr. Vikram for accepting our invite and for sharing his valuable insights and expertise with us. Your contributions have enriched our understanding and inspired us to reflect on the historical and ethical implications of AI. The successful conduct of this event would not have been possible without the strong support and guidance of our mentors, Dr. Sridhar Iyer and Dr. Briju Thangachan, and special mention, of course, to our technical team members, Vivek Sabanwar, Nagesh Pokle, Sandeep Yadav, and Ramdas Roy, for their invaluable efforts. Thank you, everyone. To our participants who have been actively posing questions, thank you once again for being part of this masterclass, and please look forward to lots more exciting updates. We have updates coming up about our workshops, our featured member updates, and so on and so forth, and of course our announcements regarding T4 2024 all set to be flagged off. So thank you once again for being part of this enriching experience. Find more information about everything that we've just spoken about on our website. Thank you so much. Thank you, Vivek.
Thank you very much.